Chapter 5. More Shocking Discoveries. Mrs. Jennings returned home from her morning shopping with a very sad face. She saw Eleanor downstairs and exclaimed, "How is she, my dear?" Eleanor only shook her head. "Ah," said Mrs. Jennings, sitting down, "he is going to be married very soon, and the lady, Miss Grey, has got £50,000, my dear. And they say he needs it very much too, as he is deep in debt. But say I, even if this is the case, he has used your sister terribly. To act as if you are in love with such a pretty girl, and then fly off because a richer girl is ready to have him." "I must say this, madame, Mr. Willoughby was not engaged to my sister." "No, my dear," exclaimed Mrs. Jennings, "do not try and defend him. I was in Devonshire with you, and I know what I am saying. A good-for-nothing fellow." Eleanor said no more, and Mrs. Jennings thought it better to leave the sisters on their own. In the meantime, she would visit the Middletons and communicate the terrible news to them. But as soon as she was gone, Colonel Brandon came in. "Oh, Miss Dashwood," he started hesitantly. "I am glad to see you alone. I have something important to tell you. I hope it will help your sister." Eleanor understood him. "You have something to tell me about Mr. Willoughby? It will be the greatest kindness to Marianne if you could explain his behaviour." "I am not sure I can do that, but, however, I once knew a lady very much like your sister, the same strong feelings and a great beauty too. She was an orphan, and we were brought up together. I cannot remember a time when I did not love Eliza, and when she did not love me. But she had a large fortune, and my father decided she would marry his heir, my elder brother, and not me. We were only 17, and we would have run away together, but they caught us and separated us for the next 5 years. I was made a soldier, and she was made to marry my brother, who did not even love her. My father died soon after their wedding, and after that my brother did not treat her well. Who can wonder that she fell? But he died too, after 5 years, and all his fortune, then very large, was left to me. I returned home and immediately started to look for Eliza, but I only found her first lover. How many others there were afterwards I did not even try to count. I finally found her at last, by accident, in a house for debtors. She was dying of consumption. She lived only 2 months, and then left her daughter, 3 years old at the time, to my care. I looked after little Eliza as best I could. She had a governess and private tutors. A year ago, however, when she was 16, I made a terrible mistake. I let her go to Bath, under the care of one of her friend's aunt. She disappeared. Nothing had been heard of her until that day at Barton Park, when I received a letter from her." "Good God!" exclaimed Eleanor. "Could this have been Willoughby?" "It was him," said the Colonel sadly. "I found her in London, 9 months pregnant and with no money at all. Willoughby left her without giving her his address or once writing to her. I moved back to the country, where she is now safe with her baby." Here he stopped, got up, and started to walk about the room. "And have you seen Mr. Willoughby since?" Eleanor asked, when he seemed calmer. "Yes, we have met with our pistols. I to punish him, he to defend himself. But as we are both still alive, not many people have heard of it." "Thank you," said Eleanor, shaking his hand as he was leaving. "It was most kind of you to tell me all of this. I shall pass it on to my sister as soon as possible." At first, Marianne could hardly believe any accusation against Willoughby. She was sure that the whole matter was some kind of conspiracy of London against her. However, when she heard Colonel Brandon's story, she had no hope left. She calmed down and decided to be calmly unhappy for the rest of her life. Her only wish was to go home. They wrote to their mother to ask for advice. Mrs. Dashwood, however, on thinking the matter over, decided it would be better for Marianne to stay among her friends in London than come back to Barton, where everything would remind her of her happy times with Willoughby. Her other wish was for her daughters to have some contact with their brother, who had just written to her and informed her about his going to London. Mrs. Dashwood did not forget his or her wife's unkindness, but still felt it was her duty to make sure that the relationship between all her husband's children was good. And so the Miss Dashwoods would stay another 2 or 3 weeks under the roof of Mrs. Jennings. Indeed, Mr. John Dashwood soon visited his sisters, mainly on purpose to be introduced to Mrs. Jennings, as he understood she was a woman of fortune. He was extremely polite to her. He only waited for the information that Colonel Brandon was equally rich to be just as polite to him. When he was sure of that, he could only congratulate his sisters on being able to move in such good circles. Soon the Dashwoods were acquainted with the Middletons too. Lady Middleton was delighted with Mrs. Fanny Dashwood, and Mrs. Fanny Dashwood found Lady Middleton the most charming woman in the whole of town. This caused no surprise to either Eleanor nor Marianne. But there were even worse visitors to put up with. The Miss Steeles arrived to keep the company of Lady Middleton, and Eleanor was sure she would hear from them very soon. She was not mistaken. They visited Berkeley Street the very next day with such incredibly good news that Marianne did not even want to stay in the room to hear it. It turned out, to Eleanor's horror, that the Dashwoods were giving dinner, to which everybody was invited, including them and Mrs. Jennings, Colonel Brandon, the Middletons, and the Miss Steeles as Lady Middleton's visitors. To top it all, the guest of honour of the party was to be Mrs. Fanny Dashwood's mother, Mrs. Ferrers. Fortunately for Eleanor, Lucy was sure that Edward, who had just arrived in London, would not come to the dinner. He did not want to be seen in the same room as Lucy, as he could not then hide his love for her. And so, poor Lucy would have to face her future mother-in-law on her own.